The first thing people said about Amos Hargrove was that he had eyes like a January sky, pale, gray, and offering nothing in the way of warmth. The second thing they said was that any woman fool enough to ride into Dust Creek, Wyoming territory in the year of our Lord 1873, and call herself his bride deserved whatever cold welcome she got. Nobody warned her. And perhaps that was the greatest mercy the Lord ever arranged, because if anyone had whispered the truth about Amos Hargrove into the ear of Miss Clara Whitfield before she boarded that westbound stagecoach in Richmond, Virginia, she might never have come at all, and the whole broken world of one lonesome cowboy might never have been made right again. Asterisk if you believe in kindness, faith, and second chances. Go ahead and like this story, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe so you never miss another tale from the frontier. This one's at a reach deep. Asterisk. Amos had not always been the kind of man who made children cross to the other side of the street. There had been a time, some 10 years before Clara's arrival, when he was just a sunburned young rancher with a laugh loud enough to scatter starlings from the fence posts of his father's spread outside Dust Creek. He had married a girl named Ruth, and sweet-tempered and brown-eyed, who planted sunflowers along the fence line and sang hymns while she hung laundry in the August breeze. They had a son together, a boy named Thomas who had his mother's eyes and his father's stubborn chin. For 3 years, the Hargrove Ranch was the kind of place that made a man believe God was paying attention. Then the fever came through in the summer of 1863, riding hard on the heels of a drought that had already cracked the earth like old leather. It took Ruth and first, then little Thomas 4 days later, and it left Amos standing alone in a house full of sunflowers nobody had planted that year. He buried them both beneath the cottonwood at the edge of the north pasture, and something in him, something essential, something human, went into the ground with them. In the decade that followed, Amos ran his cattle operation with the cold efficiency of a man who has decided that caring about things only gives the world more ammunition against you. He paid his ranch hands fair wages, but never learned their wives' names. He traded at Benson's General Store, but never lingered for conversation. He drank occasionally at the Silver Spur Saloon, always alone, always at the far end of the bar where nobody was foolish enough to take the neighboring stool. The town of Dust Creek accepted him the way frontier towns accept harsh winters, as something to be endured, not embraced. It was his ranch foreman, a broad-shouldered Mexican named Ernesto, who had placed the advertisement in the Eastern papers without telling Amos until it was too late. "You are dying in that house," Ernesto told him plainly one April morning, without looking up from the fence post he was setting. "Not your body. The other part." Amos had threatened to fire him on the spot. But the letter from Clara Whitfield had already been sent by then, and 3 weeks later, her reply came folded neatly inside a pale blue envelope that smelled faintly of cedar, and Amos, God help him, read it twice before he burned it. Then he wrote back. He told himself it was only practical. A ranch needed managing. A house needed a woman's hand. It had nothing to do with loneliness. He insisted to no one in particular on too many cold nights to count. Clara Whitfield stepped off the Dust Creek stagecoach on a Tuesday afternoon in late September, carrying a battered leather trunk, a small Bible with a cracked spine, and an expression of such determined serenity that it stopped two cowboys mid-argument on the boardwalk across the street. She was not what the town expected. She was not young and timid and easily frightened. She was 31 years old, a schoolteacher's daughter from Virginia who had survived the destruction of her family's home during the war, nursed her father through his final illness, and buried him the previous winter. She had written to Amos Hargrove, not out of desperation, but out of a considered belief that two people who had each lost everything might, together, manage to build something worth having. Amos met the stage because Ernesto had told him it would be an unforgivable insult not to. He stood at the edge of the street with his hat in his hands, not as a gesture of courtesy, but because the brim needed repairs and he hadn't gotten around to it. And when Clara climbed down and looked at him with those steady brown eyes, he said, without preamble, "I expect you'll want to get settled before supper." It was not a greeting. It was barely an acknowledgement. Clara looked at him for a long moment, then nodded once and said, "That'll suit me fine, Mr. Hargrove, with such perfect composure that Amos wasn't entirely sure whether to feel relieved or unsettled. He was in fact both. The first weeks were a careful dance. Clara cooked without being asked and did it well. Proper biscuits and salt pork, venison stew with wild onions, corn pudding that made Ernesto close his eyes when he tasted it. She washed and mended and organized the disaster of Amos's ledger books with a schoolteacher's systematic precision, finding 3 accounting errors that had been costing him money for 2 years. She did not complain about the drafts that came through the parlor window or the fact that the only looking glass in the house was cracked down the middle. She did not try to put flowers on the table or rearrange the furniture or change a single thing without asking first. And every evening, without fail, she sat by the fire and read her Bible for half an hour before she went to bed, not loudly or performatively, just quietly, as though it were as natural as breathing. Amos watched her from behind the walls he had spent a decade building, waiting for her to reveal some angle, some complaint, some proof that she was just another disappointment the world was lining up to deliver. But Clara Whitfield was not performing goodness. She simply was what she appeared to be, and that, to a man who had stopped believing in such things, was more disorienting than any storm that had ever rolled across the Wyoming plain. The breaking came in November, in the middle of a blizzard that swept down from the mountains without proper warning and buried the ranch in 3 feet of snow overnight. One of the ranch hands, a young boy named Wesley, barely 17, had been caught out checking the fence line on the north pasture when the storm hit. Amos was already pulling on his coat when Clara appeared beside him with a lantern in one hand and a rope coiled over her other arm, wearing every piece of warm clothing she owned layered on top of each other, her jaw set with a resolve that could have stopped a freight train. He told her to stay inside. She looked at him and said, quietly and without anger, "He's somebody's child, Mr. Hargrove. I won't stay warm while a boy is dying in the snow." And she walked out into the blizzard ahead of him. They found Wesley huddled against a boulder half a mile out, half frozen and barely conscious. It was Clara who stripped off her outermost coat and wrapped it around the boy while Amos got the rope secured. Clara who talked to Wesley the whole way back, steady and calm and certain, telling him he was going to be all right, telling him to hold on, telling him his mama would want him to keep his eyes open. By the time they got back to the house and had Wesley thawed and breathing steadily by the fire, Amos stood in the kitchen doorway and watched Clara Whitfield press a cup of hot broth into the boy's trembling hands, and he felt something crack open in his chest, not painfully, but the way ice cracks in spring, which is really just another word for thaw. He didn't say anything that night. He was not yet a man who could say what needed saying. But in the morning, before she was awake, he went out to the barn and found the old pot of whitewash he'd been meaning to use on the fence posts, and instead he painted the parlor window trim. The one she had never complained about, but that he knew rattled in the wind and let the cold in. It was a small thing, but it was the first thing he had done for another person's comfort in 10 years, and his hands were not quite steady when he did it. Spring came to the Wyoming territory the way it always does, tentatively at first, then all at once. And with it came a crisis that would test everything. A man named Doyle Cutter, who ran a competing cattle operation 30 miles west and who had been quietly buying up water rights along Crow Creek for 2 years, filed a claim with the Territorial Land Office that would effectively cut off Hargrove cattle from the creek's eastern branch. Without that water through the summer, Amos would lose a third of his herd and possibly the ranch. The legal document arrived on a Wednesday. By Thursday, Doyle Cutter's men were already putting up wire. Amos saddled his horse with murder in his eyes and the kind of cold, focused fury that had once or twice in his life led him into situations he couldn't walk back from. It was Clara who stepped in front of his horse in the yard. Not recklessly, but deliberately, her hands raised, her voice even. "Going out there to fight them will cost you everything," she said. "Going to the sheriff's office and then to the land commissioner in Cheyenne will cost you nothing but time." He stared down at her from the saddle, jaw working. She looked back at him and said, "I'll ride to Cheyenne with you if you let me help. I know how to write a legal brief. My father taught me." He hadn't known that about her. He hadn't known half of what she was. He got down from the horse. The ride to Cheyenne took 3 days by wagon. It was on the second night, camped beside a shallow creek under a sky so thick with stars it seemed almost reckless, that Amos Hargrove finally told Clara about Ruth and Thomas. He didn't plan to. He hadn't told anyone in 10 years. But the fire was low and the night was still, and Clara was sitting across from him, mending a harness strap by firelight with her sleeves rolled up, and something about her quiet made it possible. He told her slowly, haltingly, starting twice and stopping, and she listened without interrupting, without making the sympathetic sounds that people use to fill silence when they don't know what else to offer. She just listened, and when he was done, she said they were real. They mattered, and you were allowed to carry them with you without letting them be the only thing you carry. It was the most precise and merciful thing anyone had ever said to him, and Amos looked away toward the dark water and blinked hard, twice, before he trusted himself to speak again. The land commissioner in Cheyenne reviewed the original survey documents that Clara had thought to request from the county records office before they left, documents that Doyle Cutter's lawyers had apparently been counting on no one thinking to find. The original deed on Hargrove land included explicit water access rights to the eastern branch of Crow Creek, granted during the original territorial settlement. Cutter's claim collapsed inside 48 hours. The wire came down the following week. Amos and Clara drove the wagon home through late spring sunshine with meadowlarks singing from every fence post, and somewhere on the long flat stretch of road between the territories, Amos reached across and covered her hand with his, just once, just briefly, and said, in a voice roughened by everything he'd never learned to say, "I'm glad Ernesto placed that advertisement." Clara turned and looked at him with those steady brown eyes that had never once flinched from what he was, and she smiled. Not a polite smile, but a real one, the kind that rearranges the whole landscape of a person's face. "So am I," she said. They were married properly in the Dust Creek Church on a Saturday morning in June, with Ernesto standing up for Amos and young Wesley, fully recovered and grinning like it was Christmas, holding the church door open for the guests. Clara wore a dress of pale blue wool she had sewn herself over the winter, and she carried a small bunch of wildflowers that Amos had ridden out before dawn to find and could not quite look directly at her while he handed them over without his throat tightening. The Reverend Aldrich, who had long since given up on Amos Hargrove as a hopeless case, conducted the ceremony with an expression of barely concealed astonishment that made half the congregation quietly smile. That afternoon, when the guests had gone and the ranch was still in the golden light of a Wyoming June evening, Clara went out to the north pasture to the cottonwood tree. Amos found her there a little while later, standing quietly before the two wooden crosses he had kept upright through 10 years of wind and snow. She had set a small bunch of the leftover wildflowers against the base of the nearer cross. She didn't say anything when he stood beside her, and he didn't either for a long while. Then he said quietly, "I think Ruth and would have liked you." Clara reached over and took his hand, not tentatively, not carefully, but the way you hold on to something you intend to keep. "I think she would have wanted this for you," she said. "The good part, not just the surviving." Above them, the cottonwood moved in the evening breeze, its leaves catching the last of the light, and for the first time in 10 years, Amos Hargrove stood in that meadow and did not feel like a man at a graveside. He felt like a man at a beginning. Asterisk before we close, drop a comment and tell us, where in the world are you watching from tonight? And what lesson did this story leave in your heart? We read every single one, asterisk. There's a particular kind of courage that doesn't ride into town with guns drawn or face outlaws at high noon. It comes quietly on a stagecoach from Virginia, carrying a cracked Bible and a steady heart. And it sits down across the fire from a man who has forgotten how to be reached, and it simply refuses to give up on him. Clara Whitfield did not rescue Amos Hargrove in any dramatic or sudden way. She did it the way the spring thaw works, patiently, persistently, one small degree of warmth at a time, until the frozen ground of him finally gave way and let something grow. By the following spring, there were sunflowers along the fence line again. Amos planted them himself, early one April morning before Clara was awake, pressing the seeds into the dark soil with his worn and calloused hands. He was not a man who had learned yet to make speeches about what he felt, but he knew how to do this. And when Clara came out onto the porch with 2 cups of coffee and saw what he had done, She stood there for a long moment in the cool morning air, and the look on her face was worth every cold and empty year he had ever endured to get to this one. The frontier is a hard place. It always was. It breaks things, bones, dreams, men who thought they were stronger than grief. But now and then, if a man is willing to stand still long enough and let mercy find him, the frontier offers something back. A second chance, wrapped in pale blue wool and steady brown eyes. A hand that holds on. A voice that says, the good part is still possible. You just have to let it in. Asterisk if this story moved something in you. If it reminded you that cold hearts can thaw and broken people can be made whole. Please like it, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe so the next story finds its way to you. These tales from the frontier are for every soul still out there finding their way home. Asterisk.